9 years. That is the gap between the two things this man is remembered for. In the first, he wrote the surrender of the biggest city in Japan. No siege, no bombardment, no smoke over the roofs. A whole capital changed hands in an afternoon. Across a table, in a cold room. Most never knew it was happening. The ink was barely dry before the guards changed. In the second, he is on a hill above his own hometown. There is a bullet in his hip. Below him, in the cold rain, stands the whole army of the government he built. Stay with me. The question is not why he turned on it. It is why it later put up his statue. His name was Saigo Takamori, and Japan would end up calling him the Last Samurai. To understand what he did, you have to understand where he came from. Satsuma sat at the bottom of the country, far from the shogun, with the wind coming straight off the sea. It was proud and poor, and famous for producing samurai who did not bend easily. Saigo was born into the lower ranks of that place. That was the part of the samurai class with status on paper and almost nothing in the rice bin. Saigo was enormous for his time. He was quiet in a room. He rarely raised his voice. And the reputation he built was never about his sword. People trusted him. In a century of shifting alliances and broken oaths, that was rarer than skill with a blade and worth far more. By the middle of that century, the old order was cracking. Foreign warships had come into Japanese harbors, and the shogun had no answer for them. Every domain in the country was quietly asking the same question: who should be running this place? Saigo spent those years doing the least glamorous work in history, work that never makes it into a film. He negotiated, he waited and listened. He carried messages between provinces that had hated each other for generations. He put together an alliance between two domains that had been enemies, and that alliance is what finally broke the shogun. The man who would end his life as a rebel began his career as a diplomat. Then came the moment that should have been his monument. In 1868, the imperial armies stood outside the shogun's capital. It was built almost entirely of wood, and it held hundreds of thousands of people. Every rule of that century said what came next. You surround a city, you cut it off from food, then you wait. You burn the quarters that resist, and you take whatever is still standing. Saigo commanded those armies. Saigo could have had that city in a week and been remembered for it forever. Instead, Saigo sat down with a man from the other side. They talked, and Edo Castle changed hands without a battle. No fire, no artillery, no ash on the wind. Nobody left the city with their bedding on their back. The place woke up under a new government and went to work, and the fish market smelled the same as the week before. Have you ever wondered why the Japanese capital still keeps its old street pattern and its old wooden districts? Part of the answer is a conversation between a pair of tired men in a cold room that spring. Here is where the story turns, because the government he had just built began doing things he could not accept. It ended the domains. It ended the ranks. It ended the hereditary rice that fed the entire warrior class. It brought in conscription, so a farmer's son could carry a rifle. In cold accounting terms, every one of those decisions was correct. Every one of them also took something away from the samurai who had put that government in power. And Saigo stood there, watching his own people become unnecessary by the terms of their own victory. The break came in 1873, over an argument almost nobody outside Japan has heard of. The government was debating Korea, and Saigo volunteered to go there himself as an envoy, unarmed. His own reasoning is the part that stops you cold. Saigo expected to be attacked. He wanted to be. That was the whole idea. His removal would hand Japan the pretext it needed, and it would hand the samurai class a last war to be useful in. The government said no. Saigo resigned every post he held and went home to the south, and a good number of officers and officials walked out with him. What he did in Kagoshima made everything afterwards inevitable. Saigo opened schools for the men who had followed him home, teaching the Chinese classics in the morning and weapons and tactics in the afternoon. Within a couple of years, there were branches all over the province. He would have told you he was keeping unemployed men off the street. From an office far to the north, it looked like something else. It looked like a private army, drilling in the dust, trained by the most respected samurai alive. Then the state stopped paying the samurai altogether. The hereditary rice was gone. Now it was paper. The samurai in those schools were the ones it cut deepest. In the winter of 1876, the government sent police officers south to find out what was happening down there. Some were caught. Under pressure, they confessed that they had been sent to have Saigo removed. I want to be honest about that confession because a statement taken out of a frightened man in a cold cell proves nothing. But it did not have to be true. It only had to be believed. In Kagoshima that winter, it was believed completely. The last piece fell into place that January. Fearing exactly what was coming, the government sent a warship to quietly empty the Kagoshima arsenal and move the weapons somewhere safer. The students found out. They moved first. They got to the arsenal ahead of the ship, broke the doors in the dark, and carried the weapons off themselves. And that was that. The door was shut. Nobody could walk any of it back now. Here is the detail almost every retelling leaves out. Saigo did not start this. Saigo was away when it happened. The accounts say he was dismayed when the news reached him and had to be talked into leading it. The most famous samurai rebel in Japanese history was recruited into his own rebellion by his students. Saigo Takamori knew the arithmetic. Saigo went anyway. The alternative was standing in his doorway while men who had followed him all their lives marched off without him. What came next was not a romantic last charge. It was long. It was wet. It was badly supplied. His force grew fast. 20,000 men. Against them, the government put more than 50,000 soldiers into the field. It could feed every man of them because behind them sat railways, ships, factories, and a treasury with no warrior class left to pay. Saigo's men marched north and stopped at Kumamoto Castle, and the castle held. They sat in front of those walls for weeks and never took them. The smoke of their cooking fires hung over the fields every morning. Every one of those weeks was a week the government spent moving troops and ammunition south by sea. The real turning point was a ridge called Tabaruzaka. For days on end in the rain, his men held that ridge. The mud got so deep that the ground they fought over at dawn had washed back over itself by dark. The rain got into their powder and into their old muzzle-loading rifles. The losses on both sides were enormous. Neither army broke, both of them just got thinner. But when it was finally over, the difference was not about courage. The government could replace what it had lost. Saigo could not. A warehouse fire before the war had already thinned his stores. By late summer, the situation was simple and final. No rifles coming, no powder coming. Nothing at all coming south to replace what the rain and the fighting had taken. From there, it is a retreat, and retreats are quiet. His army shrank, and then shrank again, and then again. In September, what was left of it walked back into Kagoshima. It was the town most of them had grown up in. They took position on a hill above it called Shiroyama. 500 men, cold rain, wet powder, almost no ammunition. Some of them carrying swords because there was nothing else left to carry in a war that had been settled by artillery months earlier. The assault came at dawn on the 24th of September. By the middle of the morning, about 40 of them were still on their feet. Saigo was hit in the hip and the stomach early and did not come down from that hill. How it ended for him exactly is still argued over by historians, and probably always will be. The argument is itself part of the story because Japan could not let him go. Within months, people were saying he had escaped to China. Others said India. Nobody ever found a trace of either story. That year, a comet crossed the sky, and some of them looked up into the dark and said that was him. And they meant it. And then the strangest thing in the whole account. In 1889, the same government that had hunted him down as a traitor issued a pardon and gave him his court rank back. Today, his statue stands in a park in Tokyo, in the city he chose not to burn, put there by the state he took up arms against. Almost every country has rebels. Most of them get a line in a schoolbook and nothing else. How many get a monument from the government that beat them?
So what do you do with a man like that? Saigo Takamori was not fighting for the past exactly. He had helped end the past himself. He was fighting for the people the new order had used and then had no further use for. That happens in every country, in every century, usually with no name attached to it at all. This is the man the phrase actually belongs to. That is why he is still standing there in bronze. Japan did not forgive the rebellion. It forgave the reason. There is a difference, and the difference is the whole story. Here is my question for you, and it is the one his life keeps asking. What would you do if the thing you helped build turned around and made you unnecessary? Because that is the trap he walked into, and there was nothing stupid about the way he walked into it. He won. Winning is what finished him. Nobody warns you about that part. If this story got under your skin, you know what to do. Leave a comment telling me where you would have stopped, and subscribe.